With this, we go to another very important session. Now, this is a panel discussion on post-COVID scenario, and we have large number of specialists with us. You can see some of the pictures over here. We have the best of people in their departments to answer your queries on post-COVID scenario, and all of them have expertise in their field. We have Dr. DC Sharma. You have already heard him just now, a famous endocrinologist. He is the moderator and he will take the questions to the other specialists. Dr. Pradeep Bhatia, everybody knows him. He's one of the best intensivists we have ever known. In fact, he is a gem in Jodhpur. He will be talking about intensive treatment as well as some electrolyte imbalances. We have Dr. Vineet Jain, who is a cardiologist. He is working at Medipulse Hospital. Dr. Ashwini Sharma is a nephrologist who is working at CK Birla at Jaipur. We have Dr. Kirti Sachdeva. You must have heard of her last year also and year before. She is another very good neurophysician at Medipulse Hospital. We have Dr. Alok Gupta, the professor and head of the Department of Medicine at SN Medical College. Another versatile speaker and lot of knowledge. He has a lot of experience of treating COVID patients also. And a young person, Yash Mathur, a pulmonologist at Medipulse. Again, one who has been very active in treatment of COVID patients. We have all the best and they have best experiences to share. Over to Dr. DC Sharma, sir, to please take on the session on post-COVID scenario.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to moderate this important session. I can see there is a lot of enthusiasm in the audience because I was informed that there are a lot of questions. So at the outset, thanks once again, and thanks to all the learned colleagues in the panel, all the galaxy of the specialists I've been provided, and sharing this platform. Thanks, Dr. Anand Mirav. So, dear friends, you know that novel COVID-19 infection or the SARS-CoV has affected millions of people across the globe. Around, there has been a lot of mortality. More than 2 lakh people died over 200 countries, maybe more than this figure. And still, we are talking about the second wave, third wave, and subsequent, whether this COVID infection will go. Post second wave, there have been several questions. And since we faced this infection for the first time, even the scientific community does not have answer to everything. We have, several specialists, and today we'll try to, discuss some of the issues which are controversial, still unresolved, and try to give you the latest updates about the questions and so many issues. And before we start, my request to all the panelists, since there are so many questions, I have a list of around 40-50 questions and only 1 hour to discuss. So I'll request you to be brief to the point and maybe finish your question in 40, 50, 60 seconds so that we discuss many points and many things. So I'm starting with physician. Physician played a very important role. Dr. Alok Gupta, we have been discussing about long COVID. So could you please tell us how do you define long COVID? Dr. Alok Gupta.
Basically what happens, basically when we talk of long COVID, we have seen a lot of COVID patients in so-called first or second wave or in last 1.5 years. And to our experience and the data available throughout the world is that it takes 4 to 6 weeks to recover from the COVID. When a person becomes COVID, he's if we talk of home isolation or discharge policy is 10 to 14 days, but he suffers from the acute effect of COVID up to 4 to 6 weeks. If beyond a person continues to have certain problems, whether they are psychological or physical or any kind of problem in the body, then if these problems cannot be attributed to the pre-existing diseases, then we can say that it's a long COVID. So now this term is, of course, it is yet to be defined scientifically, but practically, the thing is, if person did not have any existing disease prior to the COVID, and he continues to suffer from the new onset of illnesses, problems, whether it's then we can call the post-COVID scenario.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Alok Gupta, for elaborating upon this point. And now I move to Dr. Kirti Sachdeva. So before we come to neurology, sorry. My question to Alok Gupta, I would like to continue. In the post-COVID,
Yes,
phase or recovered from the acute infection, majority of the
Yes.
patients continue to complain of weakness, fatigue, and this was
Yes,
also defined as one of the important symptoms of the post-COVID or the long COVID. So how do you tackle, how to evaluate this post-COVID fatigue and weakness, which persists for weeks and months together?
Yes, it's a very important thing, because what happens, there are certain problems which are visible, which are be measured generally. For example, you know that diabetes and other things, these can be visibly measured, and we can encounter it. In particularly when a person complains with vague complaints like decreased appetite, lack of interest in the surroundings, chronic fatigue, like he suffers that he can, previously he was working normally, now he says that he cannot work, he cannot take long walks, he cannot go to the gym, he does not he feels quite fatigue and weakness in his office work or daily work. Then we have to evaluate. And particularly importance of this symptom is, this can be seen in many viral illnesses. We know that all viral illnesses, in the last epidemic of dengue and other chikungunya also, and so many viral illnesses, such symptoms may persist for weeks to months. The basis of certain these symptoms, scientifically, if we see, there are so many things. One is viremia, second is multi-organ dysfunction, third is the drugs, fourth is the microcoagulation in the system, fifth is the direct involvement of muscles or immunological autoimmunity, that also plays a great role when we talk of this chronic fatigue syndrome. As usual, we evaluate as we evaluate other diseases. The most important thing is, the most of such illnesses are seen not only in the hospitalized COVID patients, but may also be seen in the home isolation patients with very mild COVID. So a leading question from the side of, or high suspicion from the treating doctor is necessary to evaluate chronic fatigue or chronic myalgias or chronic weakness symptoms. We have to, of course, rule out the common illnesses associated with such symptoms, and you know, all endocrinal causes and so many other things which might lead to this, including the dyselectrolemia or other things. But if we find that all such investigations and physical examination is almost normal, then we label the patients as chronic fatigue. The particular importance of this chronic fatigue is, it is not relieved by rest. The most of the time, if you have got hard work to do in a particular settings, and if you take rest, this fatigue is relieved. But in COVID fatigue, you do not feel any relief even after the rest. So this is particularly to be evaluated.
We can't hear you.
There is some problem. DC Sharma sir, we have problem.
Okay, I will take over. I think Dr. DC Sharma is having some problem with the internet, so maybe I will continue with the questions. So my question is to Dr. Kriti Sachdeva.
Yes, sir.
In a multi-organ disease like COVID, the nervous system cannot be spared. what is your experience of treating COVID during the stroke? Because I mean, stroke and COVID relation, this has been a very common phenomenon we have heard in a lot of literature.
Yeah. We have seen a lot of cases of stroke during the COVID era, and the strokes were during the COVID illness and also post-COVID patients. And ischemic stroke was most common as compared to hemorrhagic stroke. And the type of ischemic stroke were the large vessel strokes, and that too, majority of them had intraluminal thrombi. Most of the cases, if we underwent with an MR angio, they all contain intraluminal thrombi, and the pathophysiology attributed is the microthrombi, coagulation cascade disturbances, and endothelial and dysfunction because of obstruction of ACE2 receptors by COVID virus. So most common was ischemic stroke, that too large vessel stroke containing intraluminal thrombi. This was the most common presentation seen during the COVID era as per stroke.
Thromboembolism has been a pathology in COVID, and the certain autopsy reports have shown that the basic pathology was thromboembolism. Stroke was a part of the thromboembolism, or it was exclusively only stroke in these patients?
No, thromboembolism was a part of the stroke, but I told you majority of the patient had intraluminal thrombi, but there were few patients whose MR angio was absolutely normal. And there is an article who is telling that in cases of the stroke associated with COVID, most of the cases had thromboembolism, but few were cryptogenic also. And regarding those,
okay.
Hello.
Yes, yes. Please go ahead, madam. Please go ahead.
They were cryptogenic stroke.
Thank you, Dr.
And that cryptogenic stroke, when
I would like to add, endocrinologist, to mention about the
COVID virus also attacks the myocardium, so it causes myocarditis and function like from myocardium to the stroke, and intermittent circulation has also been reported as the cause of the stroke COVID.
Okay. I have one question for Dr. Ashwani Sharma. Somehow, kidney has not been discussed very much in COVID. We have talked about lung, we have talked about brain, we have talked about infarction, we have talked about muscles and neuromuscular dysfunction and so many things. But somehow the impact on kidneys has never been discussed in COVID. Very less literature is available on the impact on COVID. How often have you come across kidney injury and renal failure in this era of 1.5 years of COVID pandemic? Dr. Ashwini, please. Dr. Ashwani, are you able to? We cannot hear you. I think there is some problem with the connection. Maybe I can go over to another. We have talked about long COVID, and long COVID has been the center of discussion.
Hello?
Yes, yes, please. Dr. Ashwani, are you available? Okay. Never mind, we can come to the question again without wasting time. A word about long COVID. We have heard in the previous lectures about long COVID. We have heard from Dr. Alok Gupta. We have heard from Dr. G.C. Khilnani. What is your opinion about long COVID? Dr. Yash Mathur?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, as described perfectly well by Alok, sir, long COVID is term refers to the symptoms which follows or are persistent with the acute COVID illness and are more than of duration of more than 4 weeks. And there is no alternative diagnosis as such to explain the symptoms. They are also termed in various literatures or various guidelines as post-COVID conditions, post-COVID syndromes, and post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. So basically, it is not established what long COVID actually is. The only practical experience and what we can define it as the symptoms which are for more than 4 weeks and are not described by any alternative diagnosis.
Okay. Sir, Dr. Pradeep Bhatia, very, very important question. Now, we always ask how much the patient should wait after a COVID infection for surgery. Now, this holds true for planned surgery, okay. And there is another group of people who would require emergency surgery. So how should we go about it? One is elective surgery, for how long we should wait, and for emergencies, what we should do.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. If it is an emergency, it is an emergency. You can't wait. If it is in a patient suffering from COVID, there are symptoms, and say, for example, intestinal obstruction or perforation, it may happen because of maybe thromboembolic phenomena, mesenteric ischemia, maybe. And if the surgery has to happen, it is an emergency, you can't wait. You have to the patient has to undergo the surgery with very high risk conditions, and the risk of post-operative morbidity, mortality has to be explained. We have to accept the complications. Unless it is an emergency, patient should not be operated till the time patient is symptomatic, definitely. That is for sure. In fact, not only that, during the COVID epidemic, not only the patients, but other patients who are COVID negative, for elective surgery, they should be postponed because hospitals itself becomes hotspot of COVID spread. So we should, and then resources should be utilized to manage this epidemic patient, COVID patient. So we should remove all the resources, not for elective surgery, not for other kind of surgery, but for COVID patients. So only emergency work should go on. So if it is an emergency, the surgery has to happen, no doubt about that, with high risk. Regarding elective surgery, say for example, if the patient is having inguinal hernia which is not obstructed, and patient wants surgery, which is absolutely not an indication. So it should be avoided, it should be delayed as long as possible. Particularly, it should not be done when the patient is symptomatic. So there are loosely defined guidelines, which is not very definitive and definitely not very strong evidence based. But there are loosely defined guidelines. Say for example, if the patient remains asymptomatic during the COVID attack, he was diagnosed with COVID positive. So one should wait for at least 4 weeks in asymptomatic patient for 4 weeks before undergoing the elective surgery. For these mildly symptomatic patients, it is recommended that one should wait for at least 6 weeks before undergoing the elective surgery. But if patient is hospitalized or in immunocompromised patients or diabetic, if the patient required hospitalization, then from the onset of symptoms, the surgery should be delayed for 8 to 10 weeks. It is recommended. And lastly, in severe cases, if the patient required ICU admission, the recommendations are to wait for at least 12 weeks. But I'm again repeating that these are not definitive guidelines. These are loosely defined guidelines because we don't have too much of data, and patients should definitely be asymptomatic with respect that active infection should not be there, no doubt about that. These are the recommendations.
So there's another related question. What are the perioperative problems we can come across if we operate a COVID patient? Is there any risk for these patients?
Yeah, lots of problems can occur in these patients. Those who are COVID recovered. We are operating lots of mucormycosis patients who are COVID recovered mostly. So since most of these patients, they have received steroids and IL-6 inhibitors, so they can be immunosuppressed to some extent, and they are prone for all kinds of infections, perioperative period, or in the recovery, or in the ICU. So nosocomial infections are definitely very high. Fungal infection is one example. Mucormycosis is one example that these patients may have because of immunosuppression and because of unregulated blood sugar. Then in a recovered patient, the pulmonary recovery can cause pulmonary fibrosis, the vital capacity will be compromised. So there is a risk of perioperative or post-operative respiratory failure, requirement of oxygen, requirement of ventilation, because patients won't be able to clear the secretion. There will be accumulation because vital capacity is compromised because of the fibrosis, and then capacities are decreased. Similarly, it all depends what organ systems are involved, because it's a multi-organ involvement in COVID. It's the prothrombotic condition, thromboembolic phenomena. This can occur in almost all the body organs. Say, for example, if the stroke occurs in the perioperative period, or if say 2 to 3 days after surgery, the patient or patient's relative might implicate the surgical procedure for stroke, but it is not like that. Or say, for example, patient had myocardial infarction. It will be because of all the prothrombotic state of the patient, which is continuing even after the recovery, even during the recovery phase. So that is the problem. And many studies have found that these patients are at very high risk of venous thromboembolism even after recovery. So in some places, the oral anticoagulants are continuously given for a very long time. So definitely the risks are high in patients because of the residual illnesses.
Okay. Dr. Ashwini, I think you are in place now. Can we go ahead? Yes. So what about kidney disease and COVID? We haven't, sir, heard very much about kidney disease and COVID. Everybody is talking about lungs and heart and nervous system. Have you come across kidney complications also very often? You're muted, Dr. Ashwini, please. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I was muted by organizers.
Okay.
So, sir, there are n number of case patients we have seen with acute kidney injury, and there are multiple studies, including approximately 15,000 patients. There was a meta-analysis, and we have seen up to 17 to 25% patients having acute kidney injury. Most of these patients were definitely having comorbidities like hypertension, stroke, and diabetes was most common. In diabetes, kidney injury did happen. The exact cause of acute kidney injury is not known, but there is some change in hemodynamics, the cytokine storm, or direct cytotoxic injury by the virus to the kidney. But yes, acute kidney injury was a major chunk of the patients had acute kidney injury, be it because of treatment also, or patients having hypotension, having pre-renal acute kidney injury. So we have seen plenty of patients with acute kidney.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Mirawa, sir, can you hear
In line
me?
with the same, let me ask Dr. Vinod. Yes, I can. Can you continue, sir?
Yeah, yes, sir. Please
Dr.
tell me.
DC, can you continue?
Yeah, yes, sir. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for the technical, disturbance.
Never mind.
So
go ahead, sir.
Right.
Go ahead.
So yes, sir. Yes, sir. My question to Dr. Bhatia about the electrolyte disturbances. If this topic has not been covered already, what electrolyte disturbances were observed by you during this pandemic?
Yeah, there have been lots of reports of electrolyte disturbances. Primarily, the electrolyte disturbances are not because of COVID directly, but it is because of indirect effects on GI tract and on kidney. So it has been observed that if kidneys are affected, or if there is this gastrointestinal tract is affected, there can be, in fact, mucormycosis of kidney and intestine has also been reported. So it all depends. The hyponatremia, hypokalemia, and hyperkalemia, they have all been reported. But it all depends upon which organ system is involved because of COVID, or because of prothrombotic state of the COVID, or because of fungal infection. So all these kinds of electrolyte imbalances have been reported in recovery.
Right, so thank you. Another question to you. We have seen that the patient remain RT-PCR positive after clinical recovery, and they keep complaining, they keep repeating the test. What is the guideline? Whether you should repeat the test, and what decides clinically that the patient has recovered from acute infection?
See, one thing we have to understand that RT-PCR simply suggests that it is nucleic acid. It is present. If it is present, that means the nucleic acid is there. It may not be virulent, it may not be replicating virus. So normally the CDC guidelines are if the case is asymptomatic or mild to moderate, then after 10 days of the onset of symptoms, if the symptoms have subsided and the patient remains afebrile without any paracetamol or similar drug, then patient can be considered as non-infective. The person is not going to spread the infection. And if the disease is severe, on some kind of support in the respiratory failure in ICU, then even then patient can be considered non-infective after 21 days. So after 21 days, if RT-PCR is conducted, it may show positive. In fact, it may be positive for several weeks, but it only shows that nucleic acid is there. It doesn't show that virus is replicating, virus is viral, and a patient is going to spread. But if the patient has recovered, now is planned for an elective surgery, say after a few months, then what should be done? Shall we repeat? Yes, because the risk of reinfection can be there, first of all. And secondly, the risk of infection to the OT personnel because of aerosol generation during anesthesia, during surgery will be there. So whenever elective surgery is being conducted, within 3 days of the elective surgery posted, the patient should undergo RT-PCR. Otherwise, CDC guidelines are that there is no need of repeat testing. It is only indicated that the patient is brought to the OT for an elective surgery so that other personnel are not getting infected.
Yes, thank you very much for this detailed answer. Another question to you. We come across, some emergency surgeries to be done in a COVID patient. So how long after, COVID infection, a person can be declared as fit for elective surgery?
Yeah, emergency, I have already spoken that emergency is an emergency. You can't wait, but otherwise patient is going to die. So we can't wait for symptoms to resolve. But if it is an elective surgery, just I have spoken that if it is, say, for example, unobstructed hernia, patient can live with hernia for several months or several years. No need to hurry. So it's always better to settle down the epidemic a bit. The number of cases, R0 factors, all should settle down so that there is no spread of infection. There is no hospital spread. Hospitals are often hotbed of infection. So one should wait. If it's asymptomatic or mild case, then one should always wait for at least 4 weeks. If the patient required hospitalization or immunocompromised or a diabetic, then 8 to 10 weeks delay in the surgery is recommended. And if the patient had required ICU admission on some support, then minimum of 12 weeks delay in the elective surgery are recommended. But I would again repeat, even after 12 weeks, if the patient is not really having good health, maintaining good health, having some residual problems, and surgery elected, it should further be delayed. There is no need to hurry because it is a pro-thrombotic state and perioperative period and recovery. Patient is liable to have a lot of problems, thrombotic complications, as well as hospital-acquired infection. So usually the guidelines are 12 weeks maximum.
Right, sir. Thank you very much for giving the guidelines and suggestions to us. A situation, suppose patient is undergoing surgery, emergency surgery. You have partly answered this question that we would expect thrombotic complication. What other complications would you expect and be prepared in the perioperative period if these patients are taken for surgery?
Yeah, see, not only thrombotic state, but it is primarily a respiratory disease. So all the respiratory reserves, whether it is functional residual capacity or vital capacity, they are all compromised. So vital capacity is required for clearing of the airways. Patient need to cough effectively. Since patient won't be able to do that, the risk of postoperative pneumonia would be there. What I'm talking about is in addition to the thrombotic complications. So the pulmonary complications, so risk of respiratory failure could be there, and postoperative patient may require some ventilation or oxygen therapy. Patient may have a perioperative myocardial infarction because surgery itself is a stressful condition and oxygen demand may be increased. So if because of the thrombotic state, if the coronary circulation is compromised, the patient may develop the SMI. Or see the patients have been receiving the steroids and IL-6 inhibitors, so they are more prone for infections also. So ICU-acquired infection, hospital-acquired infections, they are all there. So even if it's an emergency, life-saving emergency, we have to operate the patient, but then we should be aware of all the risk factors and we should brief it to the relatives. That the risk is very high.
Thank you, sir, for your guidance. In fact, today afternoon itself, I covered one topic of glucocorticoid therapy. And let me add one point that good number of these patients must have received steroids. And if these steroids were given in the large doses for maybe more than 2-3 weeks, they might be having relative adrenal insufficiency. And if these patients are submitted to surgery, keep a watch, because as such, COVID infection, suppresses body's immunity, and the mounting of the immune response by the body is blocked. That's why this is one of the proposal, one of the theory that steroids have been so effective. So keep a watch only on adrenal insufficiency during surgery, unexplained hypotension, unexplained hyponatremia, and other problems if coming up. Then keep a watch on adrenal function. Repeat. I mean, maybe you can supplement with the steroids during surgery itself.
Yes,
Perioperative.
yes, there are recommendations. Yes, there are recommendations of supplementing the preoperative and perioperative hydrocortisone at least 100 milligram PDS because of the risk of adrenal suppression.
Right. Thank you very much, sir. So my question now to our neurology panelist, Dr. Kriti Sachdeva. There have been in fact, the COVID infection has affected almost each and every system, each and every part of the body. And we have seen during COVID also and post-COVID also, several complications. Maybe it is nervous system, endocrine system, cardiology. So what complications would you like to specifically share your experience in the post-COVID period?
There can be two types of complications. There can be central nervous system complications or peripheral nervous system complications. What we have seen most commonly was the headache, followed by strokes. And that too, ischemic strokes were more common as compared to hemorrhagic stroke. 1 or 2 cases of cortical venous sinus thrombosis have also come to our department post-COVID patient. And if coming to the peripheral nervous system complication, the most common was loss of smell. We all are aware, the majority of the patient, even asymptomatic patients who are having no other symptom, they complain of anosmia and disturbance of taste sensation, followed by diffuse myalgias, myositis, and 1 case of transverse myelitis and just 1 case of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So these were the complications which have come in post-COVID patients.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sachdeva. We also saw the reports of the transverse myelitis and the GB syndrome specifically being reported in the post-COVID area. Any reports of encephalitis presenting with seizures?
Yes. There can be encephalitis, can be infectious encephalitis or post-infectious encephalitis who have an Adam-like picture presenting with alteration of sensorium in case of seizure. So there have been reports, but to my experience, I have not seen. And they both presented with seizures. Most common presentation was seizures. 1 case of PRES was reported, posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome, which came to us with a very high BP. It was around the 190 by 110. And she coincidentally found to have COVID positive patient. So these were reported. Encephalitis, encephalopathy, both infectious as well as post.
Thank you. Right. Another report, reports of Bell's palsy. We have, I'm not a neurologist, but being endocrine practitioner, diabetes.
Your voice is broken.
Presenting with Bell's palsy.
See, we are not able to hear you properly.
Recovered from COVID. And in the video we saw several, discussions about Bell's palsy being reported. Your comments? Bell's palsy post-COVID period.
Yes, a few cases of Bell's palsy have came in post-COVID patient, but as Bell's palsy can occur post herpes infection has been documented, varicella zoster has been documented, so it's as a
would like to
palsy.
You're not audible.
Dr. Sharma, we are not able to hear you well. Yes, sir.
Give him a phone call otherwise.
Experience or anybody any other expert would
Give him
like
a phone
to
call otherwise.
comment on
I think
health
there is some problem with the internet connection. So never mind, we can go further with other questions. Dr. Vineet Jain is here. What exactly are the comorbidities related to heart in COVID patients? Vineet, unmute yourself, please.
Dr. Alok, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, sir. Sorry for joining late because of some technical issues. Yes,
Never mind.
as regards the comorbidities,
Hello.
there is, I think, hello. Yes, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
please go ahead.
Okay, sir. As you know, the COVID virus strikes the myocytes, and because it strikes the myocytes through the ACE2 receptors, there is problem of there can be a problem of cardiomyopathy, heart failure, and also because it affects the blood vessels, it can cause myocardial infarction. These are certain complications which we see often in post-COVID patients. That is cardiomyopathy, myocarditis, heart failure, acute myocardial infarction. These are some things which we found commonly in COVID patients.
Do troponins and BNP levels, do they help us in even COVID infections to diagnose? Because of course in established diseases we know they are very important tests. But are there any variations in troponin test and BNP?
Actually, troponin, because it affects the myocytes as such, the virus affects the myocytes. There is without MI also there can be an increase in troponin I, because it affects the myocytes and causes release of these enzymes, and also because it causes stress in the right ventricle. COVID affects the right ventricle. There is stress over, and there is increase in BNP. So increase in BNP levels and increase in trop I levels should be viewed with caution, and you should not diagnose heart failure or myocardial infarction immediately only on the basis of this on the basis of laboratory parameters. Like if you think that clinically there should be history suggestive of myocardial infarction, also correlative ECG findings, then along with trop I, you should interpret that yes, there is a myocardial infarction, not on the basis of trop I alone, as sometimes you do. Same is the case of heart failure. There is increase in BNP with COVID infection. So heart failure also has to be seen. You should take the history, see the clinical findings, then correlate with pro-BNP, and then only you can diagnose that this is heart failure. Both these laboratory parameters should be viewed with caution and correlated clinically.
Dr. Vineet Jain, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, yes, sir.
Hello, Dr. Vineet Jain, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
There was a.
Yes, yes.
Sharma. Yeah. I have.
I am not able to hear.
My camera because this keeps. Yeah, yeah, sir. There was a concern about RAS activation. Typically, this RAS activation and modulation of the RAS activation by RAS blockers like ACE inhibitors and ARBs. Your comments on
Yes, sir. Sir, actually, there was a concern because COVID infection acts by COVID acts by binding on the ACE2 receptors, and it was found that RAS inhibitors and ARBs, they actually increase the expression of ACE2 receptors. So it was thought that probably they might, because of the increase in the expression and increased binding of the COVID, they might increase the mortality. RAS inhibitors and ARBs might increase the mortality because ACE expression would be more. But clinically, when they analyzed the data, it was found that it was not so. Although theoretically, yes, it was argued that there could be an increase in mortality, but when the data was analyzed, it was found that you can give RAS inhibitors and you can give ACE inhibitors to such patients, and they do not increase the mortality in COVID patients.
Thank you very much for clarifying this point. I'm moving to Dr. Yash Mathur, our pulmonology colleague. Number of patients were left behind with a lot of fibrosis and respiratory symptoms. So how would you evaluate and manage such patients? Yes, sir. For post-fibrosis, how to evaluate and how to manage?
So to evaluate and manage, first just giving a brief explanation regarding the pathophysiology of fibrosis, not going in much deeper details. Basically, two factors like upregulation of many cytokines and increased production of angiotensin 2 leads mainly to post-COVID fibrosis, and iatrogenic factors like hyperoxia and ventilator associated lung injury also increases the risk of post-COVID fibrosis. So keeping that in mind, the first evaluation is if initially if the incubation period is over and patient is clinically the same or he is hypoxic, and we are not able to wean him from ventilator or we are not able to decrease the level of oxygens, we keep in mind the diagnosis of post-COVID fibrosis. If we get a radiologically CT scan done, the most common findings which have been there is traction bronchiectasis and honeycombing. So if we get to a conclusion that acute infection is over and the patient is on dealing through post-COVID fibrosis, at that time we start tapering the steroids and initiate the antifibrotic agents available like nintedanib and pirfenidone. Personally, we have used nintedanib a lot because of its tolerance. It was well tolerated to people, and we don't have to titrate it like Pirfenix. So these are some ways which we dealt with the fibrosis when the patient was in hospital stay. Once the patient was discharged, a proper follow-up and proper pulmonary rehabilitation program was assigned to him or her, which has helped a lot. It has been seen that post-COVID fibrosis has been presenting in three courses. One is it progresses, second is it remains static, and third it decreases or get better. So the resolution part was very common, and the progression of fibrosis was least common as seen, and static was average common. So the basic thing is we don't have any specific guidelines for post-COVID ILD or post-COVID fibrosis. So there are many trials which have been done for CT-ILDs like interstitial lung disease regarding nintedanib and Pirfenix. So to prove the efficacy of antifibrotic agents, so this study was done where it showed that CT-ILDs autopsy and the pathophysiology was almost similar to post-COVID fibrosis. Thus, it was proven that antifibrotic agents were effective in post-COVID fibrosis as well. Further, for holistic approach and to decrease the test or investigation burden of patients, what we did and many trials have suggested that clinical correlation was the most important key to the follow-ups and investigation assigned. We used to repeat the radiography after 3 months, as it is shown that antifibrotic shows their effect after 3 months. and yes, it was seen that post-COVID fibrosis it gradually showed improvement, and patients were out with the help of rehabilitation, and their quality of life also improved a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Yash. This was a detailed approach. Your personal comments also, your personal experience also, and updating with the currently available literature. Thank you very much. Now, my question to Dr. Vinny Jain, cardiologist. Many instances of patients coming with chest pain during COVID infection time, and we know that the biochemical markers like troponin and BNP can be raised with many other clinical conditions. So how would you place the role of troponin T and BNP measurement in a patient presenting with chest pain during COVID?
Sir, actually, I have discussed this, that the whole thing has to be viewed in clinically as a whole, not only the laboratory parameters. One has to, if it is a patient is presenting with chest pain, you should first take the history properly. Then if the history is correlating with the acute MI, because most of the acute MI and angina are diagnosed mainly by history. Then you see the ECG, you can do echo, and then correlate the findings with tropi and ultimately diagnose, because only increase in tropi may be misleading in COVID infections. That is the first thing. Number two, even in if you take BNP, pro-BNP as a marker, it's an important marker in heart failure. But in COVID, again, it increases, may not be due to heart failure, maybe due to increased stress in the right ventricle, or increased because even once the COVID affects the lungs also, that may also falsely increase the BNP. So again, if there is heart failure, you have to take the history, see the patient clinically, and then correlate the laboratory findings and then come to a final diagnosis. Only relying on both these parameters alone may be misleading.
Yeah, thank you very much. So your suggestion is the whole situation has to be taken into the clinical history,
yes.
The ECG findings, echo, and the biochemical markers has to be correlated accordingly. Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Alok. Coming to you, there has been a lot of fear and anxiety during this COVID pandemic. Patients suffering from COVID, the family getting a lot of anxiety, and population at large. So your comments on the psychological aspects or the psychological impact of COVID infection on individual as well as the family.
Yes, there are many aspects. We can go on talking for hours on these issues. Particularly, we have seen, and the world literature also confirms it, that there are three aspects of the problems. One is the patient himself. Second is the caregivers and their families. Third is the healthcare providers. Now, all the three persons we have seen with all the problems mentioned in the psychological illnesses, starting from the panic disorders, panic from the virus itself, panic from dying, panic from loneliness in ICUs or in isolation, home isolation. There is an obsessive, excessive use of sanitizers. There is an obsession. Depression. Depression was a general feature of all the persons in acute phases as well as the post-COVID phase. Many patients, they continue to feel depression. And very, very important feature is, besides the loss of smell, as Dr. Kirti has mentioned, the important thing is the forgetfulness or not remembering the names even of the very known persons or family members even. This we have seen in post-COVID scenario. The second scenario is the family members of the COVID patients. They practically, after providing care, and once a family member, whether he may be an elderly person or the whole family may be dependent on his earning or her earnings, then there is a great panic associated with the viral infections, and such problems are continuing even post-COVID era. The third problem is healthcare providers. We had to really convince our team of doctors, nursing staff, class force, the persons who were responsible for cleanliness of the wards. We had to make them aware that simply doing your duty will not affect you, because there was a great fear. So psychological problems are at three levels: patients level, the caregivers, and health providers. The most problem now we are facing in post-COVID scenario, besides the depression, is the anxiety, fear, obsession, panic disorders, as well as forgetfulness. And remember, those teenagers who are, because of the lockdown, they are indirectly related to the COVID. They are not practically from the COVID infection itself. The indirect, because of the lockdown, the persons are locked, they are not moving out, they have lost their jobs, their economical sufferings are there. So there is an indirect impact of the COVID also. So if we take all these things together, there are reports that at least 30% of the patients are suffering from the psychological disorders in the post-COVID scenario.
Thank you, Dr. Alok, for elaborating a very important aspect, the psychological impact on the patients and family and how to tackle. Now, another point of controversy has been the medication use. Initially, when COVID came, we used doxycycline. There was a recommendation, not fully, use of the HCQS, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin. Then we found that they were not effective. Maybe many of them caused prolonged QT interval and might have contributed to the morbidities. What is the current status of use of azithromycin, HCQS, and any other antiviral drugs in the management of COVID?
Basically, this is a very
this question can be this question can be taken up by any expert.
May I answer?
Yeah, please, Dr. Alok.
Yes, please. So basically,
please,
these,
sure.
yes, whenever we were encountering the different guidelines, different medicines, different preventive aspects, different uses of different drugs, nowadays, with the all guidelines and over 1.5 years, we have seen that there is hardly any role of HCQS or doxycycline or azithromycin. But the thing is because the person in initial phase, we cannot differentiate whether it's a simple COVID or secondary bacterial infection. If we are suspecting bacterial infection, we can very well give azithromycin or any macrolide drug, because azithromycin should not be combined with HCQS, and HCQS is almost discarded. There are still many authorities who are advocating that, okay, we prevented so many deaths because of HCQS, because we cannot confirm it. But with the recent guidelines, we can very well say that there is no role of HCQS or azithromycin or doxycycline or any such drug. But one has to remember that there is a viral proliferation phase initially, then there is a cytokine storm, and there is a post replicating phase of the virus, which is immunity based autoimmune or the immune reactions. So looking to these phases, if you want to give any antiviral, it has to be given early and during first week of the illness. Thereafter, there is no role of antiviral. If in future also, if we will see any antiviral agent, please do not use after the first week of illness, because it will be futile. The second thing is cytokine storm and the immunity. There are so many agents, starting from the colchicine, and so many agents, including tocilizumab and other things, which might be used. But remember one very important thing: sometimes it is very deceptive. If we are encountering any septicemia or any secondary infections, then we should not suppress the immunity. Immunity should only be suppressed when there is a hyperimmune reaction. So this is a very careful weightage has to be given whether we want to use the drugs which are anti-immune or against acting autoimmunity, or any drug which is to be used in cytokine storm. So this has to be very carefully chosen by a team of experts. We have formed a team of 4 professors whenever we prescribed or we want to use the tocilizumab and such drugs, because we have seen it may act, it is a double-edged sword. And again, there are reports that it alone doesn't decrease the mortality. So if it is to be combined with other agents, then including steroid, then there is a further reduction of the mortality. So it should not be used alone. So this is very clear message that antivirals, no proven antiviral till now, which may decrease the mortality. Dexamethasone definitely decreases the mortality. Other agents are antithrombotic or the therapy, which is to be again used with a risk versus benefit. And the fourth one is the oxygen, which we were all talking about, whether the person is can be given home oxygen therapy or oxygen through nasal cannula, facial mask, or in ICU. All these therapies are to be carefully chosen with the team of the doctors rather than a single doctor. Then we can save a lot of lives, because there is a very thin edge of using all these agents. Dr. Bhatia will agree with me that even oxygen therapy has to be used with caution and very judiciously. So all these therapies are emerging. They have emerged. Now we know that oxygen, dexamethasone, enoxaparin or low molecular weight heparin, they save life. Other therapies are still evolving. We are not sure whether they can really save the lives of the patients.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alok. Again, another question in continuation of your comments. Wonderful comments. Any change in the pediatric population? Any recommendation, separate recommendation for pediatric population, or we have the same guidelines and same treatment to be?
No, because literature is not available as regards the pediatric population is concerned. The only thing we know about the pediatric population is that there has to be very judicious use of steroid, because as we say that steroids, enoxaparin or low molecular weight heparin and oxygen, these are the life-saving agents. Antivirals presently not recommended in pediatric population, only symptomatic treatment, plus very judicial use of steroids. One has to consider the benefit versus harm it may cause to the pediatric population. So judicious use of steroid plus oxygen in vulnerable or sick patients, and again the low molecular weight heparin weight-based can be given. Besides this, there is no recommendation of any antiviral agent or any other therapy which might help in pediatric patients.
Right. Thank you very much. Now there is a question from the audience about obesity and the risk of COVID infection, and I would like to take up this question. Obesity as such has been a risk factor for severe COVID infection, and this has been because of adipose tissue expressing more amount of ACE2, the receptor on which this virus would initially attach and then produce viremia and other tissue injury. So in obese patient, there is a high inflammatory load, more cytokine storm, and associated comorbidities are higher. So obese patient had higher morbidity and mortality. In fact, obese patients also are likely to have occurrence of diabetes, which would worsen the mortality and morbidity. So obesity is definitely a risk factor. Very interesting question to Dr. Yash Mathur. Again, a question from audience. There is a notion that smoking COVID morbidity, reducing the comorbidity. Is it true or?
So pardon, sir.
Smoking and COVID.
Smoking and COVID. No, sir. It is in fact, smoking is a predisposing factor for any of the pulmonary infection. So basically, smoking is a big predisposing factor for even for post-COVID fibrosis cases. Patient who has been smokers or has been diagnosed as COPD. In fact, the mortality and severity rate were also very high in these patients, and they led to longer ICU stay and longer hospital stay. And so, smoking is in fact a predisposing factor and increase the chances of severity of a COVID patient and COVID disease.
Right. Thank you very much. There are few questions left, and if the organizers allow us, we will finish up maybe taking up 2-3 questions. So, Dr. Minawat, can we continue? Can you carry on for some 5 to 7 minutes? Okay. There are questions about
another.
Okay, 15 minutes.
15 minutes we can continue.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. So there are some questions about the diabetes. Diabetes has been,
Yes.
and I'll answer this question. There is a question about diabetes, new onset of diabetes, and how diabetes behave in the patients who had diabetes, how it behaved during COVID period. We know very well that diabetic patient had high morbidity and mortality. In fact, the mortality in diabetic patient was 3 times higher than the background population. And there were several explanations for this. The diabetes in patients who had already had diabetes, hyperglycemia worsened. It is a well-known fact. And I would like to talk about the new onset diabetes during COVID. And several mechanisms have been proposed for the new onset diabetes during COVID. In fact, there are evidence that the COVID infection had caused direct beta cell damage. So direct beta cell dysfunction has been reported. Then immune-mediated attack on beta cells have also been documented. And dysfunctions of beta cell as a bystander. I mean, exocrine pancreas being affected, and as a bystander, beta cells were affected. This was the beta cell involvement in the COVID infection. And in addition, insulin resistance was also worsened. And this insulin resistance is because of cytokines. Cytokines directly antagonize the insulin and cause a lot of insulin resistance. In particular, one chemical, fettuine, the levels of this protein were documented to be very high, and this caused a lot of another important factor which was documented in diabetic patient, new onset diabetic patient, was hypokalemia. Hypokalemia could be produced because of several factors in COVID infection, and hypokalemia also contributed to insulin resistance. And all these factors in combination led to new onset diabetes, especially those who had a lot of stress, severe COVID infection, receiving steroids, and all these factors contributed. In addition to type 2 diabetes, another important endocrinopathy I would like to share is we have documented several cases of subacute thyroiditis immediately post-COVID period, and even in the long COVID phase also. So unusual subacute thyroiditis presenting with thyrotoxicosis were reported by many colleagues from our country and the literature throughout the world. In fact, the common cause of thyrotoxicosis being Graves' disease. But in this period, we came across so many cases of subacute thyroiditis. So subacute thyroiditis resulting from altered immunity and immune dysregulation was one of the important endocrinopathy. And cases of adrenal insufficiency were also documented. So my question now to Dr. Kriti Sachdeva. Any role of this remdesivir causing kidney injury?
Remdesivir causing?
I think your question is
Dr. Kriti.
with
Remdesivir.
Dr. Ashwini.
Yeah,
Remdesivir and kidney
Sorry,
disease.
sorry. Yeah. Dr. Ashwini, nephrologist. I'm sorry.
So, sir,
Remdesivir
the-
contributing to renal dysfunction.
yes, sir, definitely there are plenty of evidences that has been seen that remdesivir is causing kidney injury. Remdesivir per se doesn't cause the kidney injury, but some of its active metabolites are there which causes acute kidney injury. So if the GFR is less than 30, we can go on with hydration and all, and the acute kidney injury can be treated conservatively. But if the GFR is less than 30, then it is recommended that the patients, after receiving remdesivir, for 3 to 4 hours after receiving remdesivir, they should be dialyzed so that these metabolites, active metabolites, which causes acute kidney injury and ATN, these can be these are dialyzable, and 40 to 50% of these active metabolites can be dialyzed and further prevents from happening developing kidney injury.
Right. Thank you for elaborating upon this point. A question to Dr. Anand Minawa, sir. Or maybe this question can be taken up by Dr. Alok Gupta. Vaccination, what are the guidelines about vaccine for COVID infection? How long patient should wait for vaccination after COVID
Basic,
infection?
yes. The recent guidelines, they say that you have to wait for 90 days after the vaccination. Previously, there was no such guideline from ICMR or from any agency. We were really surprised because we were knowing it, and every doctor knows that natural COVID infection will give you an immunity which will be rather better than the vaccination. So initially there was no such guideline, so everybody was vaccinated. But now we know that after development of COVID or COVID positivity, one has to wait for 90 days, because 90 days they will have the, at least, of course the immunity will be much longer, at least 6 months, but it is practically after 90 days the antibody titer starts falling. That's why we have to the vaccine should be deferred by 90 days after the COVID, recovery from the COVID. This is the latest one. And then 2 doses have to be given. There is some problem that a person who has received first dose and then he was COVID positive. Now what to do? Should he repeat the 2 doses? No. Now second dose again may be given after 90 days. So these are the now ICMR recommendations from the vaccination. And one second important thing is, till now, of course, there is a small study which shows that antibody titer may be better when mixing with the different vaccinations. But still, WHO has cautioned, and the manufacturers have cautioned against it, because the data are dependent on the antibody titers only. They are not a real scenario or world scenario type situations. So mixing of vaccinations at present is not really recommended by most of the bodies of the world. And whenever we should promote vaccination, even if the patient has suffered from the COVID, 90 days period is, as I have mentioned, is the right thing to do.
Thank you, Dr. Alok, for this combination of vaccine. I was about to ask you, and you already clarified. Wonderful. Another continuing the vaccination part. role of booster dose in the USA and other European countries, people are going for planning for booster dose. So booster dose, any discussion in our country in pipeline about the booster dose?
Yes,
This
yes,
obviously comes in mind because the effect of vaccination
yes,
lasts for a few months. So the
yes,
we know that the antibody starts declining after a few months.
yes, yes,
Any role
yes.
of
There are two opinions about the booster dose. One is that because there is a decrease, falling titers of the antibodies, so booster dose can be given after 6 months. This is one opinion. Second opinion is okay, the titers are falling, but the T cells have got the memory, and whenever a person will come in contact with the virus or antigen, they will start producing the antibodies. So there are two different opinions on this issue. There is no real clarity. There is no clarity in the guideline. Some countries or some societies have started doing it after 6 months. There are some persons who are visiting from India to US. They have received a booster dose after 6 months, but there is no consensus on this particular issue. We as a doctor and as with our experience, we can say that as we repeat the doses of influenza vaccine every year, probably it will be very soon. They will have certain guidelines on this particular issue. There will be clarity on this issue, whether we should receive booster after 6 months or after 1 year. Now this is in the pipeline. Probably in a month or so, they will issue clear guidelines, various bodies, and then we will be more clear. At present, we can say that a person who has got associated illnesses, particularly serious illnesses, by whom there is a decrease in the immunity, they should receive the booster at 6 months. In persons who are otherwise healthy and not suffering from the other diseases, they need not to go for booster at present scenario.
There's a question in the chat box. The present COVID test. Somebody has asked about present COVID test. So what is the ideal COVID test which should be done?
The ideal COVID test remains RT-PCR. There is no doubt about it. The only problem comes when there is an emergency. In emergency, we can go for antigen test. If antigen test is negative, and we are suspecting a person to be having COVID, then we should go for RT-PCR. If antigen test is positive, need not to go for RT-PCR. So in certain emergency situations, for example, if we are preparing a patient for surgery, tooth extraction, or any minor or major procedures, or is there any emergency, we should go for the rapid antigen test. And if it is positive, need not to repeat any test. If it is negative, then RT-PCR will be the ideal test to be performed. So RT-PCR remains the gold standard of diagnosing COVID, but in emergency situation, the antigen test should be performed.
Dr. Bhatia, there is a question about D-dimer.
It has been done very often in practically all the patients and has been repeated also.
It has been done very often in practically all the patients and has been repeated also very often. How important do you think is D-dimer?
We regularly get D-dimer tests done in our patients, and that really guides us in anticoagulation therapy, low molecular weight heparin therapy, but a strong then these are not the recommendations. D-dimer should normally not be the guideline. So since we have to give low molecular weight heparin, and the doses still are debated. So normally, if the D-dimer levels are more than double the normal doses, normal values, then we give intermediate doses, 0.4 BD in adults. Otherwise, we give only prophylactic dose of 0.4 BD and OD enoxaparin. So D-dimer actually guides us whether to give prophylactic dose or the intermediate dose. the therapeutic doses are not recommended because they increases the risk of bleeding. So these are the values, it really helps us.
Then talking about RT-PCR again, can this RT-PCR test detect all variants?
Practically it detects the variants which are present in India till now. About newer variants, we are not sure. The Brazil variant and other variants, we are not sure that it will be detected because of the antigen variable antigenicity. But till now, it is detecting all the variants present in India.
One last question in the chat box is
One last question in the chat box is poly vaccine.
which is the vaccine which is
Most effective vaccine.
Which one? Pardon, which
vaccine is the most effective? There are 3 or 4 of them available here now.
Again, it's a very difficult question. Seems to be very easy, but difficult question because different vaccines are available in different countries.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatia, for your comments.
Dr.
From sir, any other questions?
From all.
question.
The last question.
And aspirin.
Role of NOAC and aspirin as oral anticoagulant.
Because there are a lot of companies who have brought new NOACs.
Because there are a lot of companies who have brought NOACs.
Dr. Vineet, can you tell us?
Dr. Vineet, can you tell us
The role of NOAC and
the role of NOAC and
aspirin.
aspirin? Dr. Vineet, we are not able to hear you.
Most effective vaccine.
I think from cardiac point of view, Novax and aspirin are given, but from only COVID point of view, Dr. Yash will be suited better to answer this.
Dr. Yash, what do you think NOAC and aspirin? Yes, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Now I can hear you.
What about NOAC and aspirin?
In COVID, sir, in COVID point of view, what we have seen as the during the acute phase of COVID, we have gone for, yes, sir. Enoxaparin was the
Yes,
best
go ahead.
effective as my practical experience, sir, enoxaparin was the best effective when the patient was in hospital or ICU stay. We have also tried fondaparinux, which also showed very good results. While after the on discharge or on for the follow up and when the patient was sent home, we switched him to rivaroxaban tablets, which were
muted.
So basically, sir, personally, enoxaparin, fondaparinux, and rivaroxaban has shown good results in COVID.
But Dr. Yash, is there a general consensus regarding this? I don't think there is a general consensus regarding this. There is, there are some controversial. The role of Novax and the role of aspirin, I think, in general, is controversial. There is
No,
no general agreement.
yes, sir. It is controversial. No such guidelines or no such trial has been set up. So it is actually the role of aspirin is controversial till date.
Although people are giving, but sir, there is no general guideline as such, and
No general guidelines, sir. And the results of sir enoxaparin and these are good and they are also established. So we go for that.
The questions are not going to end. It's time we should wrap up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sir for joining with the experts from different parts of Rajasthan, and thank you for such a wonderful organization. I think people must have been listening, and they must have been benefited a lot. Thank
Yes,
you
sir.
very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so
Thank-
much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a very nice
Thank you.
session. I think well moderated, concise, and made us lot wiser. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, DC. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for moderating the session so wonderfully. खाना खाना खा नहीं नहीं नहीं